Welcome everybody to Spirituality Adventures. This is a non-judgmental place to explore spirituality, and we're so glad you're here. This is a viewer and listener supported podcast, so we greatly appreciate your support. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Be sure and like, share, and subscribe to any of the social media content platforms that you're using. And then if you go to our website, spiritualityadventures.com, you can make a one-time donation, or with a monthly subscription, you'll gain access to our bonus content. We greatly appreciate it. Thank you for tuning in. Welcome everybody to Spirituality Adventures. This is a non-judgmental place to explore spirituality. Thanks for joining in today. And we have an awesome guest today. I'm so happy to introduce you, if you don't know him, to Adam Hamilton. Adam is the founding pastor, and do you call yourself senior pastor or lead pastor?
Yep. Senior pastor.
Senior pastor of Church of the Resurrection in Kansas City, and actually Leawood, Kansas, technically, right? Or at least, actually, you have multiple campuses, so
yep.
You've got footprints all over the Kansas City, greater Kansas City area.
Sure.
And Adam, this is, I think, is this the largest Methodist church in America?
It is the largest United Methodist Church in the United States.
In the United States. He founded this church in 1990. And you were telling me that you're working on your, 30th book right now?
Something like that. 31, 32, I think. I'm not
just like,
way too
where do you get all the energy, Adam? That's what I want to know.
Yeah.
My gosh, crazy. So, but I am so honored to have you as a guest, and I'm honored to call you certainly a colleague, and appreciate that we've tracked together for almost 30 years almost. Yeah. Really.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. So for those who don't know much about you, why don't you just share, where did you grow up? Give us a little snapshot of your growing up years.
Sure.
And how you came to be a pastor.
All right. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you for having me on your program today, Fred. I've appreciated you. You and I have known each other for a number of years, and we ran really parallel tracks. You in the North Kansas City area, and me on the South Side, and really our stories, our faith stories, are so similar too, in terms of when we met Christ, how we saw the world. When you speak, so many of the things that are going through your brain are the ways that I think as well, and so I appreciate that about you, and appreciate your heart. And so thanks for inviting me to be a part of this. And
my blessing.
Folks who are listening wouldn't know, but I'd had a chance to go speak at your congregation up in the Northland, and again, just have a great appreciation for who you are. So thank you.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
Well, I was thinking in the 90s, even I had you. I don't know if you remember this, but I did a little conference on Outward Focus Church.
Yep.
And we had you and Doug Murin and Steve Sjogren and myself speak. That was our lineup. That was a lot of fun. Yeah.
That was fun.
Anyway, good guys.
Fun. Yep. Well, I grew up in Kansas City too. My folks were from the Kansas City area. They were in high school at Shawnee Mission East, and it was their junior year in high school when they were at an unsupervised party in Leawood, Kansas. And 9 months later, I was born. So they dropped out of high school to have me, and got married. And my dad was Catholic. My mom was Church of Christ. Got married in the Catholic Church, moved out to Tucson, Arizona. And I was born, I think, 7 months after they got married, or 6-7 months after they got married. And so I spent a little bit of time in Tucson, a couple of years there. Then my folks moved to Wichita. Is that right? Yeah, they moved to Wichita, and then my dad went to work for Boeing, and then they moved to Seattle, Washington, and then finally moved back to Kansas City when I was in first grade. So I would come back regularly to visit my grandparents, but it was in first grade we moved back to Prairie Village, and I lived there until I was in eighth grade. Eighth grade moved. My folks got divorced in seventh grade. Eighth grade to Lenexa, Kansas, out by Shawnee Mission, or actually out by Oak Park Mall, not far from there. And then in ninth grade, my mom and stepdad moved to, way out into the country to an area called Blue Valley. And at the time it was the southern part of Johnson County, and moved out there. And when I had, similar to your story, I think when I was in probably eighth grade, I began experimenting with drugs, drinking, the stuff that a lot of kids were doing at that time. And, And so as a freshman in high school, we just moved into this house. There was no sod on the ground yet. And we had a guy came knocking on doors, and he just knocked on our door and invited me to come to church. At that point, I would have told you I was an atheist, and his invitation somehow really, it just stuck with me. This guy, his vocal cords had been removed, and he spoke with what looked like a microphone pressed to his throat. His name was Harold Thorson, and he wasn't a pastor. He was just going door to door, inviting people to the church he went to, a little Pentecostal church. And, my mom came home from work that day and said, did anything happen today? And I said, well, yeah, this funny sounding guy came and invited us to church. And she said, well, do you want to go? And I think precisely because of his disability, it touched my heart that he would actually talk to me, a 14-year-old kid, like I mattered, and he didn't try to share the gospel with me on my doorstep or anything. He just gave me a business card and invited me to come to church. But though I didn't believe in God, I thought, I guess so. Let's go to church. So we went to church that Sunday. I'd never been to a Pentecostal church before, been to Catholic churches. We went to a Methodist church for about 3 years when I was in, or maybe 4 when I was in junior or middle school. Elementary school. And so we went to this Pentecostal church, and it quite honestly, it freaked me out. It was like, what is this? There was the hand raising, tongue speaking, fiery preaching. It was very different from anything I'd ever known before. But there were 3 really cute girls on the front row of the church. And I thought, well, I don't believe in God, but I believe in girls.
That's right.
So I started going back to church, and I married one of those girls 4 years later, and we've been married now.
That's so crazy.
Last week. So that's,
wow.
And so I graduated from high school, Blue Valley High School out in the Southland, and my kids graduated from there years later, and became a Christian out there at this little Pentecostal church. Really became a Christian through reading my Bible, and just started reading the beginning. Started in page 1 because I'd never read it before, and somewhere along the way began to think maybe there is a God, and maybe God is something like this, and got to the Gospel of Luke, and I don't know if I would have used these words, but I sort of fell in love with Jesus in the Gospel of Luke when, it's the gospel of the nobodies, where Jesus cares about the marginalized and the pushed down and the people made to feel like they don't matter. And I was one of those kids who felt a little that way. And I got to the end of that gospel and said, Jesus, I want to follow you.
That's awesome. Every time I talk to you, I think of another connection. But so I was born in Wichita, Kansas, and moved to Prairie Village when I was in kindergarten, first grade.
No kidding.
So I went to kindergarten at Belinder, and I went to first, and then moved and went to first grade. We lived on 70th Street between Tomahawk and Rowe, and I went to Prairie Elementary School, first, second, third, fourth, fifth grade.
Yeah, I was there too.
I'm 2 years older than you, I think.
Okay. Yeah. So I was there at the same time. I was Somerset Elementary School. My parents rented a house, and they bought one at 68th and Delmar. And so, I went to Prairie Elementary School.
So we were at Prairie together.
We were.
That's crazy.
That is totally crazy.
And then, the other thing we found out was that my former wife and I were married on June 5th, 1982.
Yeah, this is really bizarre. You and I both married June 5th, 1982. It's just crazy.
Mine lasted 37 years. You're still going. So anyway, crazy.
Yep. That is amazing.
Wow. Yeah. So that is so fascinating. My dad was a TWA guy. So when TWA moved north in 72, we moved north. And so
my grandpa was a pilot for TWA.
Oh, wow.
His whole career. Yeah.
Wow. My dad probably knows him.
Yeah, probably so.
I mean, my dad seems like he knows everybody.
Amazing.
Wow. Okay. Well, so we're both Kansas City guys. So what do you love about Kansas City? Give me like your top couple of things.
Yeah.
That you love about Kansas City.
I love the friendliness of the city, for one. I think it's a really friendly, warm city in most places. I love the fact that it's got the amenities of a larger city, but it still is a, mid-sized city. I mean, it's 2 million people in the metro, but it still doesn't feel like it's not a huge city. And, but mostly it's the people, I think. I really love the people in Kansas City, and we've, it's home. So I've had multiple chances to go serve in other places and other cities. I went to seminary down in Dallas at Southern Methodist University, and had an opportunity and lots of opportunities, but I just really love the city. I love Kansas City. I don't know, it just kind of gets in your system, I think. I know people who grew up there and don't love it, but to me, I love the people. I love the city. Yeah.
That Midwestern ethos is a real thing, and very, very hospitable, down to earth, kind kind of, yeah, good stuff. So what's the craziest thing you ever did in Kansas City that you can talk about?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. I can't really think of too many crazy. I haven't lived a crazy enough life. I don't think. I think back when I was a kid in high school and doing stupid stuff when I shouldn't have had a driver's license. Back then, you could get a restricted driver's license at 14, and I got my first car, a VW Bug, at 14, and I did some really stupid stuff driving that car in ways that should never have been driven, and I'm very glad I didn't die in the midst of it.
Sure.
But other than that, how about you? What's the craziest thing you did in Kansas City?
That I can talk about. No, some of my teenage, I started smoking pot in 8th grade up in park with the basketball team. I can't speak for all the basketball, but a lot of my basketball buddies. And man, we did crazy stuff. That was a couple of years of crazy, and then I gave my life to Jesus when I was, like 16. So felt called to be a pastor when I was 16. So, but yeah, I had one crazy phase. I had one crazy phase, called it a prodigal phase. And then, here all these years later, I had a second crazy phase, Adam. That's why I'm not. So we won't talk about that crazy. I have actually talked about that publicly, but I don't want to go there now. At any rate, those are about that too. Yeah. Those are some of my crazy things. Yep. What's your favorite part of Kansas City's history? That's a big question, but if you just had to nail maybe one or two things. Well, I'll connect Kansas City's history with Methodism for a second. So just because it happens to be my tradition, not because we're any better than anybody else, in some ways worse than everybody else. But when Kansas City started, the very first Protestant church in Kansas City was what became Central United Methodist Church. And it was started in the city of Kansas before Kansas City was what it is today. And so with the Methodists coming there as, to begin gathering a group of people to pursue the Christian faith, they played a key role. Methodists are always interested in both what we might call the evangelical gospel and the social gospel, where we believe that we're called to follow Christ, and that, following of Jesus is meant to work itself out in actions in the community. And so when the first public school started in Kansas City, Missouri, it was started in the basement of Central Methodist Church, or maybe it was Westport Methodist Church. That was the second church to get started. So the public school started in a Methodist church on the Kansas side of the state line. The public school started at Shawnee Indian Mission, from which Shawnee Mission is named, and Mission Road is named. It was the road to the Methodist mission. And so Methodists had this passion for helping people be educated because they believe that education would be a means for them to live out their life from the world. Education was key to that. Then there were hospitals that were started, and there were social service, agencies that were started. But, that's one of those things that I think that history of, who the city is. Thomas Johnson, after whom Johnson County is named, was a Methodist missionary. And so there's just a lot of ethos there. And so, I think that's interesting. The fact that the city was founded, that half the city was on the free state side and half the city was still in that sort of area where slavery was allowed, makes for an interesting dynamic too. And I think our history, there's a lot of sad things, in our history when it comes to race, and things that I think that our healing is starting to happen. It's been happening for decades, and I think that's a good thing. So anyway, those are some things I find fascinating just from, my own place as a Methodist pastor, how integrally involved the church has been in trying to shape the city. The first college started, in Kansas was Baker University, and as a Methodist school. K-State was started by Methodists. UMKC was started in the basement of Central Methodist Church, and so a lot of fascinating. That's great. That's great. Good stuff. One of my favorite, I've always loved nature. I've always loved the West and like mountain men. I thought I was going to be a mountain man at one time, when I was, a young teenager. And so I always like the fact, like they say St. Louis is kind of the end of the East, and then Kansas City is kind of the beginning of the West. Yeah. So like it was the kickoff point for the Oregon Trail, Santa Fe Trail, California Trail, westward stuff going on there. Fun stuff. What about?
Wait, hold on a second. I want to say just
Yeah.
a word about that, because there's places where you can still, some people in Kansas City don't realize you can still see the trails from those, have
Ruts.
you seen those?
Yes.
Out by
crazy.
Baker University near Baldwin City, there's a park out there where you can, if you get there at the right time of year where the grasses are mowed down, you can still see those ruts. And I do think that's just fascinating. And when we designed, so our sanctuary at the Leawood campus, which, is this, huge thing that some say looks like a spaceship, but when we, not by design, that wasn't the intention, but when we oriented it to the west, and part of that was to recognize this idea of the Methodists when they came here were like taking the gospel to the west is part of what they were doing. They were also, along with a lot of other Christians from the Northeast, trying to claim Kansas as a free state. So there were a lot of people, and I think this is really fascinating, that people relocated from Massachusetts and New York and Pennsylvania to Kansas, the prairie, solely based on their belief that God was calling them to do that so that they could claim Kansas as a free state, so the slaves wouldn't be held there. I mean, I just think what a mission that these people had. Their sense of the gospel was so much broader than just go tell other people about Jesus. It was, we're supposed to make a difference. And if we can by uprooting our family and taking a wagon to Kansas, we can help that be a safe territory where people are free. Yeah. Then we're going to do that. I just think that's a pretty, that's an interesting part of our history.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful. Yeah. And one of the things I was going to ask you is, like, if there's something you could change, what would it be? And I'm almost guess it's probably along some of those lines, because we still have such huge divisions, and
we really do. Even
in the district, the neighborhoods and the poverty areas and all that kind of stuff.
Kansas City, a few years ago, Kansas City was the 13th most racially segregated major American city. Yeah. And it may even be more than that, higher up that list now, 10th or something. And that's something, since we started the church, one of the things we talked about is how do we break down the racial barriers in our city, and how do we build bridges? And, we've made fits and starts, at trying to do that. We have I'm proud of some of the things we've done, but you still find that those walls are really hard to bring down. Yeah. Troost is a pretty strong dividing line. And, and my dream and hope would be, somebody asked me this same kind of question a few years ago, and I said, I'd love to know when I die that Kansas City Kansas City was racially, integrated in terms of its neighborhoods, its communities, its, economics in every way, that our city looked more like the kingdom of God than it does today. And that's one key area.
I'm with you. And I've had that same heart and passion. I even now, since I'm not pastoring, I attend the largest African-American church in Kansas City, Missouri right now. And it's just been intentionally, just to still keep that going, and still keep the networking going that I have in the urban core. Yep. Yeah. Well, let's jump out a little bit and talk about America, the spiritual landscape of America. And what I'm thinking here in particular maybe is not the whole 200 plus histories, but maybe like the last 50 years, particularly as we think about the de-churching of America. Let's spend just a few minutes on kind of that whole trend that's been going on in America for decades now, like almost every state, almost county by county, de-churching of America.
Yeah. So you may have seen this. We've been hearing a lot about how, the number of people who are actively members of congregations dropped below 50% for the first time, and since they were tracking that number, or at least in modern history. So I was going back to look to see what did it look like over the course of our country. And there's I don't remember, it's Gallup or somebody's put together this chart to show. And, we were way more unchurched back in the early to mid 1800s than we are today. So we're more church today, but we're way down compared with where we were in the 1950s. And it's an interesting, and there's been a shift, so we went from mainline churches being the predominant, the seven sisters of the mainline, Presbyterians, Methodists, Lutherans, Episcopalians, Congregationalists. I'm forgetting one of them. I can't remember who it is, but
Baptist?
those not Baptist.
Not Baptist. Oh yeah. Yeah. We're talking mainline. Yeah. Yeah.
Mainline. Although American Baptists are pretty much mainline, but you watch that shift happen in the 60s. So in the 50s, the mainline church, the United Methodist Church, was the largest Protestant denomination in America in 1968. And the Southern, but it had already been in decline. And the Southern Baptists, began to surpass that by 1980, I think, or something. It was larger, maybe late 70s. And part of that was starting lots of churches, and part of it was a reaction to I think probably the 60s and 70s. So you have a reaction to the cultural movements to the left, led people looking, more towards the right. And there is this pendulum that swings, throughout history, this, that you can find reactions, constantly going, the pendulum going back and forth. So I think that's part of what happened there's multiple factors that were involved in the decline of the mainline. One of them was the reaction to a more progressive bent in some of those churches. Part of it was the fact that Methodists stopped and mainline churches stopped starting new churches. So they kind of lost that evangelical fervor for starting new faith communities where people are moving to, whereas the Baptist and non-denominational evangelical churches really picked that up, and they started churches all over the place. Your church was an example of that in the North. I had a more evangelical bent in the South and started Resurrection in the Methodist Church, but that was kind of unusual. There was birth control, and the fact that lots of mainline churches embraced birth control, and yet both Catholics and more conservative Protestants were a little late to the game to embrace birth control. And so that had something to do with the aging of our communities. We weren't growing the fun way anymore. We were growing, and we weren't evangelically reaching out to people, then we were not growing. So I think those are all pieces of that puzzle. But today what we find is the Southern Baptist Church is declining faster than the mainline churches are declining. They're losing.
Isn't that interesting?
It's fascinating.
That's only happened in the last decade.
Right. The last 10 years.
Yeah.
And that tells us something about a shift in, again, that pendulum kind of swinging. Churches, charismatic Pentecostal churches, it's masked sometimes. And because a lot of folks don't take attendance, we take attendance everything we do here, and we have people sign in a log, we know every Sunday somebody's there, but so there's that. And then there's that part of that pendulum is the larger cultural shift. It's away from a whole host of things that have been characterized that characterize some of the more evangelical and conservative churches. It's a shift on how we look at inclusion and LGBTQ people. For younger adults, it's a shift away from a kind of, and part of this is the more conservative movements. There's some real mistakes there, I think, including a way of sort of looking at science is kind of the enemy. This goes all the way back to the, Scopes monkey trial and evolution, but believing that someone has to take a very literal reading of Scripture. I think an increasing number of people find that problematic. So you've got a large number of people in America who don't believe in evolution and believe that the earth was created in the last 10,000 years and humans were created fully formed, which is just almost impossible for somebody who's a mainstream scientist. And it's, I would say, literally impossible. And so you have this sort of the dominant picture of Christianity in the 80s. So many of the folks in that movement find themselves at odds with thoughtful people today. And then there's a lot of other questions. We live in a world where we're meeting people who are of different religions. We have school teachers who are doctors or Hindus or Buddhists or Muslims, and the world has gotten so much smaller, and it becomes harder to imagine being in a church where you're going to talk about my neighbor as somebody who's going to burn in hell for all eternity. And so there's just a whole lot of those kind of things that have led to a shift away from those more conservative evangelical churches. There's still a lot of vibrant churches like that, but there's been a shift away, and the churches that could be perfectly poised to reach those people are mainline churches. It's just that they've kind of forgotten how to do it. You go to a lot of churches, and the worship may not be very dynamic. The preaching may not be great. The churches, you go in and you feel like everybody in there is much older, and it's, if you're in your 20s or 30s, you may not feel like that's a place for you either. So it's a challenge. There's a need for a new kind of church. And as Brian McLaren talked about a new kind of Christianity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I might refer people to our conversation that we had on Timmy Gibson's show a couple of weeks ago. People might be listening now and miss that, but there's one of Adam's friends, my friend now, is a guy named Timmy Gibson. He has a podcast called Timmy Gibson Show. And we spoke about the Bible and some of these issues on that podcast. And yeah, I agree with you. And, the rise of the megachurch while the main line was declining, and that, the megachurches have gotten so much attention. You and I pastored a megachurch. I started with 5 people, and I grew really slowly, I wouldn't have hit megachurch until sometime after 9/11, and I started in 1990. Right. But we just kept growing and growing every year. And, soon enough, there's this, so the megachurch is kind of phenomenal, and they get a lot of attention. A lot of them are evangelical, right? But they've also come under a heavy critique, and they have their own unique challenges. They have their, there's some big ups, and there's some challenges as well with the whole megachurch world. And people don't realize that the megachurches are only a fraction of the churches in America. When you just look at, say, if there's like 350,000 churches in America, I don't know how many there are, but somewhere in there, it's less than 1%. It's like 1%.
Yeah. I don't remember how many churches there are of that size. I think
it's a little over 2,000. It's less than, I think it's less than 1% of the churches are actually mega churches.
Churches also are not monolithic. I mean, you have mega churches that are all over the map. You've got churches that are prosperity gospel churches, a lot of them that are out there that are, their theology is, very different from, say, the mega church you led, or, Church of the Resurrection. And I don't even like the term mega church because there's so many connotations that go with that. And I think the same was probably true with you. We didn't start off to go, let's go build a mega church.
Right.
I'd never even been to a mega church. The biggest church I'd ever been to had 300 people Sunday in worship. And so, where I started was, I want to do the best job we can of welcoming people. I want to welcome that people are welcomed here and that they feel loved, and that here they're finding a faith that's vital. And then I want to turn them inside out so they're going to go serve God in the community and help transform our city so it looks like the kingdom of God Jesus talked about. But one of the things we said was, we're not going to turn people away. We're going to do whatever it takes to welcome people. And so when we had one worship service in the little funeral home chapel that we started in, and it was all of a sudden there was no more room, we said, we're going to start a second service. And I remember our people like, well, we can't. Jesus didn't call us to build the Christian version of Cheers where everybody knows your name. He called us to welcome people and to love people. So, we kept trying to, we do whatever it took. So we went from 2 services to 3 to 4 to 5. And, we told people, don't invite your friends who go to church somewhere else, because this church isn't for them. Have them stay at their churches. Not that we wouldn't welcome them, but we're a church to try to reach thinking people who don't go to church somewhere else. And so, and we outgrew one building, we built another one and another one. But the goal was, we're never going to turn people away. We're not going to say, well, we're just going to stay this small and then hope, nobody else comes. But we're going to do whatever it takes to welcome people. And we're going to try relentlessly to help, people who maybe aren't involved in church to go, you can be a smart person and you can have integrity and you can be a part of a church. And part of what we said is, when you get to a certain size, there's pluses and negatives for every size church. There's some beautiful things about being in a small church, and there's some great things about being in a big church. You can do things that no other church can do. You can offer unique programs. You can do things to reach unique segments, whether it's special needs children or whether it's serving with support groups for, almost anything that you can imagine. Or, and when you look at, a small church, you might think, in a lot of Methodist churches, about 90% of the budget goes to pay the pastor's salary. And at Resurrection, a tiny, tiny fraction pays the pastor's salary. It's all, we're giving away millions of dollars every year and serving, the community. And so there's a lot of stuff you can do when you've got larger numbers that you can't do when you're small. And I don't know how you felt, but when we had probably 120 to 150 people a weekend of worship, I felt like a failure as a pastor because I couldn't keep up with everybody. I couldn't do my job and also be there for everybody all the time. And so it's amazing how small you But, today we have a team of, lay volunteer ministers that are like 150 of them that are, calling on people and caring for them. They're specially trained. And then we've got all these great pastors and staff people who are doing amazing work. And so, and I used to tell people, I don't know where I heard it. Maybe you've heard this. You probably shared this too, but if you don't like a big church, you're going to hate heaven. It's going to have a ton of people there. Jesus is feeding the thousands, when he's teaching and multiplying the fish and the loaves. And so there's a way to do large church well, and there's a way to do it that lacks integrity. And so our hope, your hope and my hope was to try to do it well. And at the same time, every church has its shortcomings. There are places where people get hurt in churches. There are places where churches miss the mark, and that's true whether you're a church of 12 a Sunday or, you're a church of 12,000 a Sunday.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. When I hit about 200, I went through that thing where I felt so guilty all the time because I felt I'm disappointing more people than I'm helping. And it was kind of like a bit of a crisis for me. And I had to kind of make some shifts there in terms of, not being direct care, but empowering people to, like you're talking about, empowering more people to care and be shepherds and ministers and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah. So it's interesting. So Kansas City, is such an interesting place. Like you gave some of the Methodist history, and I don't really want to dive into any of this, but you've got, I think the headquarters of Unity is here in Kansas City. RLDS's headquarters are here. Yep. Or in Independence, part of the greater Kansas City area.
Yeah, now they're called Community of Christ.
Community of Christ, right. Yep. Yeah, and I think Joseph Smith prophesied that Jesus was going to come back at Independence.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
The Muslims think it's going to be Jerusalem where Jesus comes back.
Right.
But Joseph Smith said Independence.
Yeah.
Who'd have thunk?
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. So we're close, I'm in Kansas City North. You're down in Leawood, right? No, you're out at the lake anyway. So you're at the lake right now. Yeah, you're going to miss it. All right. So anyway, no, but it's an interesting city. We just had up in the Northland a new Mormon temple built up here a few years ago. And I have never, when I got on social media, I had never, they have so many missionaries up here now that are on my social media thing. It's so fascinating. Really? Yeah. Very active community. And so, and then every faith tradition is represented across our city. I remember after 9/11, me and Steve Sjogren went down to a local mosque in Kansas City and offered to serve them and just clean the building and stuff right after 9/11. And we had people in tears just because we showed up. They thought we were going to bomb the place, I think. And we showed up to show God's love in practical ways.
I love that. That is such a beautiful sign of, and I didn't think to do that after 9/11. I wished I had. I did reach out to some of the Muslim community, but we've tried the same thing to try to have a relationship where our Muslim friends knew that, we were in their corner, that if somebody harassed them, several years ago, there was a mosque in the southern part of the city that somebody sprayed spray paint on their sign or something. And, I showed up there for their Friday prayers and just said, hey, I just want you to know, I'm your neighbor and we're your neighbors. And Jesus told us to love our neighbors and we love you. And, that kind of thing. I wish there was more people doing that. I love that you guys did that right after 9/11. That was a hard time to.
Yeah. It was funny. Steve was tired, worn out. And I said, what do you want to do? You've got about, a few hours to take a break. I mean, literally this was weeks after 9/11 and his wife was with him, Janie. And he goes, let's go find the closest mosque and offer to just clean their bathrooms and their mosque and all that kind of stuff. So we literally went down and did that.
That's awesome.
Took a janitorial cleaning kit with us.
Yep.
They wouldn't let us. They wouldn't let us do it. They told us that we had to that they had to serve us, and they were having a conference, and they stopped their conference, hosted us, offered us things, gave us a tour,
Wow.
And afterwards, the guy, they're in tears. Like they said, the Quran says that Christians have a kind place in their heart, and we've seen that today. And there were just people in tears. It was just
That's awesome.
Beautiful thing.
That's one of the things Steve Sjogren I appreciated about his approach to ministry. That was his thing, was going out and cleaning toilets and stuff and walls and whatever, wasn't it?
He still is.
Yeah, that's he really?
He's still doing it.
Some of your listeners may not know who that is, but he was the founding pastor of, was it Cincinnati Vineyard?
Yes.
Yeah, Cincinnati Vineyard. And really, I had gone up to visit his church in 1998 when I was on a sabbatical leave, and it was one of the largest churches in the country at the time. And I'd read his book, one of his books, I can't remember what it was called, Friendship Evangelism maybe, or something like that.
Conspiracy of Kindness, I bet.
That's it.
Conspiracy of Kindness, yeah.
Yeah, and it's such a great book and just such a great picture of, if Christians actually live that way, it would just fundamentally change our country if Christians were practicing that conspiracy of kindness, and not from any motive other than just to be kind.
Right.
We're this isn't to win you to Jesus. This is to just live what Jesus taught us to live. And we're working right now on a campaign at Church of the Resurrection that we want to give away to other churches. And actually I'm working with our team plus the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, Michael Curry, and Jack Danforth, former ambassador to the UN, Episcopal priest, and also Matt Malone, he's the editor-in-chief and publisher of America Magazine. He's a Jesuit priest. And so we've been working together on how do we mobilize the church to actually pursue kindness, especially in the light of our political polarization.
Right.
Maybe the church has a unique role to play in trying to bring people together. And so we're looking at, this last year we did this campaign called Love Your Neighbor, which was just a resurrection campaign, but we're going to be that was in 2019 and 2020. But in 2022, as the elections are heating up again, we're going to be having sort of Love Your Neighbor 2.0, which will be focused on kindness, because kindness is what love looks like lived out. I love
that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let me know if I can help in any way. I love that's been my heart from day one. Steve and I became friends. John Wimber asked us to be on a national evangelism committee together way back in the early 90s. And we bonded around this kind of stuff. And we're still in contact. He's been with me through these dark days that I've gone through. So
that's awesome.
Love Steve. Well, hey, so it's interesting. When I started the church in 1990, and you were starting your church, we were both focused on wanting to reach people who are outside the church, irreligious, nominally religious people. And that was my heart. That was your heart. I remember when I came to Kansas City, and I was trying to figure out, I moved back to Kansas. So when I graduated from high school, I lived in Texas for 8 years, and I lived in Virginia for 3 years. And I moved back, started Vineyard in 1990. I was looking for all the churches. I was looking for some mentors. So I literally did research on a bunch of the churches that were Protestant churches across denominational lines that had a pastor who had been there, let's say, I can't remember, the 15 or 20 years maybe, whose churches had been, reaching people for Christ, who had a relatively stable staff, and who had just a good solid growth record, right? So if you put those statistics into, and you start trying to find churches that have the same senior pastor for 15 or 20 years, who's been growing and, dynamically reaching their community, it really gets to be a small number of churches. I mean, and you think of, I don't know how many thousands of churches there are in Kansas City.
Yep. But
when you start applying those little factors to the churches, it ended up being a pretty small stack of people. Yep. And I remember I called every one of those pastors, asking if they would meet with me to see if any of them would just be mentors to me. Right. And so I remember like Ted Nissen at Colonial Press.
Sure.
And that was kind of an easy one because my mother-in-law had set him up with Linda Nissen. And this one was one of my mother-in-law's best friends, and she set him up. Anyway, and then so Ted was there. I remember Charles Briscoe and I connected. I'm sure you know all these people as well.
Sure.
Vernon Armitage in the Northland.
Yeah.
I remember George Westlake.
Yep.
And so there were several, and all of them were so gracious, so as my church grew, I remember when pastors would reach out to me, I always made time for them.
Yeah.
And so you think about, like, you're still going. You're 31 years into this now.
Yep.
And you're still going. I made it 28 years. And even that like goes against the grain, right?
Totally goes against the grain. Yep.
So I want to kind of jump into this part about where we talk about some of the challenges of pastors, because we had dinner a couple of weeks ago, and I think you made a comment to me. It says, pastoring a mega church can be, I can't remember the words you used, maybe like dangerous to the soul, or can be hazardous to something along those lines, like that, right? And I don't know if you might have a better updated statistic, but I think the average pastor in America stays at their church less than 3 years, if I'm
something like
correct.
That. Yeah.
Less than 3 years. I think seminary graduates, once you hit the 10-year mark, most of them, more than half of them, are out of the ministry.
Yeah.
So I know there's a lot of professions in America that have high burnout rates. So some of my audience that's out there, I mean, people working and they get burned out and they just get depleted and, but they need a paycheck or whatever. I don't,
Yep.
But I mean, it could be, I've heard the social workers, high burnout.
Social workers, nurses, in the helping professions, when you're in the helping professions, a lot of high burnout there.
Some I've heard lawyers have pretty, law school graduates end up, a lot of them don't stick with it. But yeah, let's talk a little bit about the challenges of why is being a megachurch pastor dangerous or potentially dangerous to a person's soul?
Well, and I think it's probably not just being a megachurch pastor. The megachurch part can add dimensions to this. It adds, you have power. So on the negative side, there's power. There's the potential for you to believe you're above the law. You can begin to believe that these people are actually coming because of you, which is, you have plenty of people who will tell you that, I'm here because of you, pastor. You're the one, you're the reason. And if you actually let yourself believe that, you actually start to think, hey, I'm really something. Look at this. Look at all these people. And no matter what size church you are, dynamic churches, they're highly dependent upon their pastors. So we often look at mega churches and say the weakness of the mega church is its dependency on its pastor. I don't care what size church you're at. If you're at a church of 100 a Sunday and it's growing and things are really happening, there's probably a pastor there that people love and they feel connected to. And so the same thing happens just on a much larger scale in a mega church. And so part of what you've got to do, no matter, and this is true in almost any helping or any profession, is if you start to believe, you start to really think inside, hey, look at me, look what I've done. And the beautiful thing about the Gospels is it's so the opposite of that. It's like, Jesus tells us the ones who want to be great are going to be your servants, and so, but I think that's one of the dangers to the soul is that you've got this organization and people want to know, what does Pastor Fred think? What does Pastor Adam think? What's their, and so somewhere in there, making sure that you are continually reminding yourself that you're lucky that you got to do this, that it's God that's, if there's something amazing that happens, God is the reason why it happens. So I would say that's one. And that ties into, if you think of the seven deadly sins, pride is one of the, is actually considered the most dangerous of them. So I think we see that sometimes. I think that's on the negative side. I think on the other side, when you are giving yourself, so you don't build a mega church without putting 60 hours a week, 70 hours a weekend. You're not the one who's building it, but here's what I found. This may not be true for everybody. Maybe more gifted people can do this easier and better. But I found that every time if I could put in a few more hours, there'd be that many more people who would be reached. There'd be that many more programs we could offer. I could, if I could spend a little more time on every sermon, it'd be that much better sermon, and so I found myself working for I'd say the first 20 years, average 65 hours a week, probably, maybe more. Which means you've got to figure out how do you do family and have 65 hours a week? How do you take care of your kids? How can you be a good dad? And so I try to balance all those things by just not sleeping. And I know I'm not much of a sleeper, but I thought, okay, if I can live on 4 to 5 hours a night of sleep, then I can be there for dinner with the kids, and I can go meet them at lunch in elementary school and push them on the swing set while I hurry back to the office. And I can be there for half their soccer game in a suit and tie while I'm going to do a wedding right at the end of the soccer game. And, I can write books and I can do all these things. And so you're doing all this stuff. And if you're doing all of that and you're pouring yourself into people and you're caring for them, and what you're going to find is if you're not replenishing your soul, then you find your idea banks dry up. You find, like right now I'm on sabbatical leave. I get a sabbatical once every 6 or 7 years. That's basically 10 weeks. And it's during those times I write, but it's also during those times that I'm reading. It's during those times last night I took an hour and 10-minute walk, and, I spend that time praying, and often I'll have my pocket testament with me. And I'm, if you see me down the road, I'm walking with my Bible. It's a pretty stupid thing to do because you're not paying attention where you're walking. But I mean, I'm just trying to figure out, and so I come back from that hour and 10-minute walk, and I feel renewed. I feel energized, but a lot of times when you're working 65 hours a week, you don't have time to do that. Then you don't take your vacations, then you don't take your day off. And then, for most of my ministry, it was 1 day off a week. And still it's maybe a day and a half, but and so I think you can easily find yourself emotionally burned out, physically burned out, spiritually burned out. You're not doing the things that help you renew. And this is where I think even, like I take for years, I took a week just for sermon reading and research and planning, to a week away to a retreat center. And I started trying to teach business guys this, like, you would be a better business person if you'd take a week away by yourself somewhere in silence and retreat, and you'd pray and walk and think and take the stuff you want to read that you don't have time to read during the week. And you'd come back with dreams again, because I think we run out of dreams. Every sabbatical leave, I leave and I come back with my idea banks renewed and recharged, and my soul, renewed. And so I think all of those are factors in it. And then I think, I'm sorry to be doing all this talking, I'm going to shut up and let you respond. But I think also, the line of work we're in, there's no shortage of critics. And this last year in particular, during, the election season, George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, COVID, there were several other pieces to this. In the United Methodist Church, this divisions over homosexuality and how we'll be in ministry with LGBTQ people. There was just no matter where you turned or what you said, there was somebody who was mad. There were people who were mad because we weren't having church. There were people who were mad that we were talking about having church services in person. There were people who said, we'd only come to church if you don't make us wear masks. And there are other people who are like, we're only coming to church if you make people wear masks, and
yes.
Then, I can tell you're against President Trump, and, why aren't you speaking out more against President Trump? And, Black Lives Matter, well, no, it's all lives matter. Well, no, it's Black Lives Matter. Well, and so no matter where you went, if you were a preacher trying to speak to your culture, to what's going on in the world and apply the gospel to it, you're going to have people who are mad and leaving the church.
Yeah.
And after 31 years of doing this at Resurrection, it doesn't affect me as much as it once did, but I will tell you that it still bugs me. It still is like, when I hear another family left the church over something. Mm-hmm. And, for everyone that's leaving, we have another one that comes in and they're like, this is the very church I was looking for. I'm glad you're here, but you feel the weight of that. And so when you get that kind of criticism, you can easily feel like, or criticism over how you led or what you're doing. And it's easy to go, I just don't need this. This isn't fun anymore. And so, at least those are some of the things that in my mind go into, into burnout.
Yeah.
I think it's true in any size church, in any pastor. This last year in the United Methodist Church, I think I heard this for the Southern Baptist too, that there were more pastors chose to leave the ministry and or quit at in the last year as a percentage than maybe any year that people have been monitoring this because of the amount of conflict in our society and what that felt like. Because pastors are people who, they want to be liked. They're people, like, and half the pastors are introverts. Yeah. So people are surprised by that pastors are introverts, but they are drawn to the spiritual life, the interior life. And yet at the same time, they're in a people job and they want to be liked. And you tend to hear from the people who are unhappy and you don't hear from the people who are happy. And so,
right.
So I think all of those play some role in
definitely. And I pulled up my journal from the early 2016. This was before I had my crisis and went to rehab and got out of ministry and all that. But I was writing down, so I was trying to deal with all this stuff. I wrote down all the issues I was struggling with, and I was going to a counselor working on those. But it's like, I'm more of an introvert than an extrovert, even though I can do both, right? I can do both really easy, but I do get a lot of the anxiety when I'm getting ready to speak in front of a large crowd. People can't tell it. As soon as I start speaking, I feel like God takes over or something like that. But the guilt component, I don't know if guilt's the right word, but managing people's expectations. Yep. I always feel like you're disappointing people. The rejection that comes from what you were talking about. I always told people, if you have several thousand people that are coming, it just means that like 20 or 30,000 people left. It's like way more people leave than stay, right? And so the rejection factor is massive. Think about how many people have left Church of the Resurrection or left my, it's thousands. You put people together and work together. You always have conflict to manage, crucial conversations to have, all of that stuff. Yep. Money is always, talking about money, raising money, those things.
Capital campaign,
workload. And then you're supposed to have this model marriage, model family, model kids.
Yep.
Yeah. And so, and then I was an insomniac. Like I wasn't even sleeping 4 or 5 hours a night.
Yep.
I was sleeping 2 or 3. So, but I say all that, and, my marriage was, not on good, solid ground really ever. And so you throw all of that together, and the guys that make it 10 years, 20 years, 30 years are actually the exception, Yeah. And so I'm praying for you and cheering you on. I want you to know that. And I've greatly appreciated your leadership and the way you've served our city. It's beautiful, and I love it, and I appreciate it. So, what would you say to people out there who are listening to that and like they're going, I'm not a pastor, but I can relate to some of these burnout factors, especially after COVID and all the things you just reeled off in the last 2020 and into 2021.
I think there's a lot of people who are going to be, are and will be struggling.
Speak to the people and give them some practical ways to deal with this, and kind of close this out maybe with some good thoughts that way.
I will. But first of all, I want to say to you, Fred, I was thinking about this after we had dinner the other day, and just thinking about the fact that God is not, I love the fact you're doing this podcast, you're starting some other things up, because God is not finished with you yet. And the crises that we have and the moments where we walk through, where it seems like everything's coming apart, that those end up being, when we continue to trust in God, those end up being the pivotal moments that God uses. God rebuilds us and puts us back together again. God is the master of the redemption story and the God of the second and third and fifth chance. And I love the fact that, we're all broken. We all end up crashing at times. You made it a lot longer than most people do at 28 years. And you did it when things weren't going great, in your marriage and other things. But you did it. You kept getting up and showing up and doing everything you could. And on 3 hours of sleep, I don't know how you did it. I don't know how you did it all of the years that you did. But I know this, that I think your heart and your gifts and who you are is treasured by God. And I think that God has, you're trying to figure out right now, okay, what are you going to do with this mess, God? How do you put all this back together again? But I think God is doing that in you. And we talk about the wounded healer, and that I think ends up being a great metaphor for, who you are and where you are and how God We'll tune into your podcast and other things. It's somehow knowing that the person I'm listening to knows a lot and has a lot of experience, but they also know what it's like to be broken and know what it's like to be lifted out of the pit. And I think that's, and wisdom is what is knowledge we gain through lived experience, and the greatest wisdom comes through the hardest things in life. So that's where I see you, and I just want to say I'm just grateful that you're putting one foot in front of the other and not giving up. And God, I know, is using you and will continue to do that in ways that will surprise you in the years ahead. I'm confident. And I would say this.
Thank you. That's my hope. I still have dark days where, I have to battle for that hope. I really have had to battle for it. But yeah, that's my hope, and that's what I'm going for. So thank you.
Well, there's no way you can't still have dark days. You're not out of you're still in the middle of all this. Right. But you've made a turn though, and the turn you've made is pretty dramatic. And I think about, again, this is Scripture. A lot of times people read Scripture and they assume that they don't read Scripture. They assume that the Bible teaches this Pollyanna view of life, that if you believe in God, everything's going to be great, and God's promising nothing bad's ever going to happen to you. And it's like, anybody tells me that, I'm like, you've never read the Bible, have you? Because the Bible's largely the story of the brokenness and mess and pain in life. And whether it's the Israelites enslaved, or Joseph, who ends up being tossed in the dungeon from Potiphar, or the Babylonian exile, the Assyrian destruction of the northern kingdom, the Babylonian exile took Jesus crucified and the disciples being put to death. I mean, it is not the story of how everything's great. It's the story of, Lamentations, where the writer is looking at the smoldering ruins of Jerusalem and saying, my soul is like wormwood and gall. But this I know, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never fails.
Right.
His mercy never comes to an end. It's new every morning. I mean, I'm choosing to believe that, even though I don't feel that right now, which is what faith is. Faith is believing that the future in some way, because of God, in some way will be more meaningful or in some meaningful way be better than the past.
Yeah.
It may not be in every way, but in some ways it'll be more meaningful and better than the past. That's what we believe. That's what we hope for.
That's right where I'm at. That Lamentations 3:22-23 you just quoted is exactly where I'm at and what I'm hanging on to.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And that's what I'd say to you. Asked, what would I say?
What would we say as we kind of close this out? Yeah.
This has been a hard year, and there's going to be a lot of PTSD in response to this. And, we're emerging from some things. So there's excitement, like at new beginnings. And at the same time, there are people still unemployed and people's businesses that have been lost and people who are burned out and worn out, especially in the helping professions. And that's not over with. The other day, I talked to a counselor who said that the therapists she knows are all way more busy than they've ever been, that there are more people coming to therapy now than during COVID, as people are trying to put their lives back together again. And so, part of that I think is being able to say, if you're a person of faith, being able to say, God, what can you do with this? What can you and will you do with this? And I'm going to continue to trust that you're with me. I'm going to continue to trust that you have the capacity, that in your providence, you have the capacity to take the challenges and the hard things in life and to force something good to come from them. I love how Dr. King talked about, God's capacity to bend or wring from evil something good. And that this is how God works in our lives and in our world. And, we quote it as a sort of, it's almost trite and cliche, but, the idea in Romans 8:28 of in all things God works together. Not that God causes all things, but in all things God works together for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. For those who are trusting him, he has the capacity to bring good from suffering. And if you look back on your life, and every one of us, if we look back on our lives, the most painful and hard things in my life are all the things that shaped me in ways that I'm grateful for today, but I couldn't see it at the time. All I could see was the pain. And I think we have to trust that God is working in you. God didn't cause this, but whatever it is this is an opportunity for God to work and to bring beauty from ashes. I mean, this again goes back to Isaiah. He gives us beauty for ashes and, joy for sorrow and all of that we might become oaks of righteousness. And I think somewhere in there, works, and I count on that. So we say a lot around resurrection. Buechner, I think, first said this, but the worst thing is never the last thing. That's what Easter says. Worst thing is never the last thing, and there's always hope. And sometimes you just keep saying that to yourself, even though you don't really believe it.
Right.
So one day you go, hey, you know what? It is true. The worst thing is never the last thing.
Yes. Yeah, that redemptive arc of, creation, the incarnation, how Jesus models entering into suffering, bearing it, redeeming it. That's my hope. That's what I'm clinging to. So
that's a great model. Yeah. You think about the fact that the single most, the thing that most shaped was the darkest moment of Jesus' life.
Yeah.
That she prayed that would take away from him. Mm-hmm. Crucified, and it's on a cross that the world is going to be changed, through his experience of the crucifixion and the resurrection. Yeah. Right? That there's a resurrection after the crucifixion.
Yeah.
And I know that's true for you, Brad, and for many others, for all of us.
Yeah. Well, Adam, thank you so much for joining us on our podcast, Spirituality Adventures. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. I again appreciate you so much, and look forward to listening to future episodes of this podcast.
Thank you. Well, I'll see you next time. Thanks for tuning in today, and God bless you today. All right. This concludes today's episode. Thanks for tuning in and listening. Remember, if you're watching on YouTube, subscribe to my YouTube channel. Remember to like, share, or subscribe to the social media platform that you're using. And then go to our website, spiritualityadventures.com, and make a one-time donation, or you can subscribe monthly and receive our special bonus content. Thanks so much.